The point of this session is really to bring everything that we've been discussing this morning together and to connect, obviously, with everybody in the room. If you have any questions, keep throwing them at me. After we've heard from our speakers chatting together for a bit, we'll turn the lights up and get some questions going. But before we do that, I just want to ask our whole panel really to do a bit more crystal ball gazing than even we've done so far this morning, and look not just, as Ian was doing, to the general election, but far beyond, let's say up to sort of 2025, and just give me a vision of what they think the biggest changes in the specific areas we've been talking about this morning might be. So I'll start on the left, Mark, and come to you and just say, fast forward to 2025, what do you think the biggest change factor will be?
Well, I suppose if I had, for the UK, I think it is that world upside, literally the world upside down, which Graham showed us, that shift of the centre of gravity from west to east. I don't, in so many ways, we all see when we go to destinations, we see Russians and Ukrainians and Chinese with more money than we have. How are we going to accept that, or are we going to adapt to not being as rich as we were? And I think it's interesting politically, Ian could probably comment on this, that we seem to have accepted a sort of long-term erosion in our standard of living from generation to generation without kind of protest or revolution. But there will come a point where I think people do start rebelling against that and realise that we're getting poorer unless something is transformed.
Malcolm, you were nodding there. Obviously, there's a lot of connection between what Mark was talking about there, the quality of life for us, and what you've been talking about as in the entire planet.
I think this connected world that everyone's been talking about, that's going to drive the bit that I've been talking about, which is that group of stakeholders are getting more and more knowledge quicker, and they are going to hold people to account. And I think we are going to see by 2025, I think corporates will be saying much, much more about how they improve people's lives as opposed to what profit they make. Because I don't think in the connected world of the future you will have a license to operate if you're not having positive outcomes.
Ian, you were talking about how things are going to, have already changed as a result of the coalition government, particularly, and people perhaps being a bit more promiscuous with their politics and their voting patterns, and they might vote one way, as we've seen in one election, another. How, if we take that to the very extreme, could we see, do you think, political parties completely die? Could we see new political parties and protest groups? Could British politics look very, very different?
I think it could do. What we're seeing is the end of the political party. If you look at political party membership figures, they've plummeted. The Conservatives have just over 100,000 members now. In the 1950s, they had 2 million. The Liberal Democrats are down to about 40,000. UKIP are the only ones that are showing an increase. So, as I said earlier, we're seeing the end of the political party, the rise of the single issue pressure group. Most young people nowadays do not join political parties. They identify with causes, that they're interested in politics, but they're not particularly beguiled by party politics. So by 2025, which, it's only, 12 years away. It sounds an age away. It's actually only 12 years. We could get to a point where we've really seen the rise of the independent. We've already got we've got Caroline Lucas as the only Green MP. There have been one or two independent MPs over the past few years. That could, in theory, multiply over the next few years, but our electoral system tends to mitigate against that. So I think it's unlikely that we'll see the total end of party politics. But I think that a lot of things could well change dramatically over the next 10 years. But it's incredibly difficult to predict what that might be. Could we see Prime Minister Farage, God help us all?
There's an image to conjure with. And Graham and Ian, I guess this is, if you take that to the next extreme, or the next possibility, okay, if we've lost one or two political parties, perhaps we've gained a lot of independent political policymakers or so on, what would the effect of that be? Would that be a total dysfunctional paralysis, or is there a way that, particularly internet, social media and so on, you could have, it wouldn't be a traditional political party, but movements, and would there be any democracy in that?
Well, and I think all of that is part of a bigger trend, which is this younger generation who don't attach themselves to any organizations or affiliations, or at least feel a lot more fluid and flexible about that. And I think that impacts a variety of different aspects of our lives. So politics would definitely be one. If you're going to be successful politically in the future, you're going to have to attract the youth vote, get them voting to start with, and then get them voting for you. But I think if we take the original question of looking forward at 2025, that I think is a huge issue, where the younger generation is going to go with their affiliations, where the younger generation is going to go with their mindsets, and particularly where they're going to go with work. We have the highest youth unemployment we've ever had in recorded history, and that's true in every country that measures youth unemployment. And that's not going to go away. The technologies that Matt was talking about are just going to multiply and make sure that there aren't the jobs there. The economy is going to be a jobless recovery for similar reasons. And by 2025, I think we're going to have a significant number of young people unemployed, self-employed, and then disenfranchised from the system. And I think that will change the world a lot.
Matt, I don't know if you can put any more positive gloss on the use of technology, particularly in the hands of a tech-savvy youth, but perhaps a youth with no jobs.
I think what we know is that actually it's far easier to find out what people think about stuff now. Is that we did have that sense that political parties only existed because you had to put together a manifesto so that everyone could get behind it, so you could try and get some stuff done. And you knew that not everyone agreed with all of it, but you at least had a sort of program for government. Whereas now, if we can find a new way of negotiating it, then at least you do know whether the majority of people do think HS2 is a brilliant idea or a terrible idea. You do have a way of getting access, and it's all about data again, to finding out what people think. It's not necessarily a coherent way of governing a country, but it is a much more intelligent way of finding out what the people in it think.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, we've seen government by focus group, and we've seen the damage that can do, because what it does is leads to a vacuum of leadership. I mean, Ian, do you think that that's a possibility, that this new world that we're in, actually we've got so much data, big or small, but so much data about what people want, which quite often doesn't show an overall desire. It shows lots of people wanting different things, and that can end in political paralysis.
Well, we live in a representative democracy where we elect people to take decisions on our behalf. However,
in theory,
in theory, we now live in an age where we could have much more of a direct democracy. Now, other countries, New Zealand, Switzerland, for example, they will hold referenda at the drop of a hat. We think it's a bit of a novel idea to have a referendum. But of course, where do you draw the line? Because a lot of people say, well, yes, the people should decide on everything. Well, do we have a popular referendum on restoring the death penalty? Do we have a referendum? I mean, it's very difficult to know for a politician where you should draw the line. But I think it's entirely right that if you have the ability to consult in a more direct way, you should do that now, because we all know that people are very sceptical about the way government handle consultations, because people always imagine the result is predetermined anyway. So somewhere along the line, we ought to be able to use the kind of technology that Matt was talking about to have real consultations that people can feel that they have actually had a say.
Well, Mark, bringing all that back to the travel industry specifically, and also picking up on what Graham was saying earlier about challenging orthodoxies. In other words, we all know how things work, but that if we're going to move forward rather than stand still, we've got to challenge those orthodoxies. And when I was listening to Graham, I wanted to know what you thought about that, about the travel industry particularly. What are the orthodoxies or the accepted norms that you think should be challenged, and perhaps if anyone else in the room thinks it's time to change the way things are done in this industry?
Well, to be fair, I think the travel industry has had to already change some of its old orthodoxies, even in the time I've been around in it for 8 years, and that was, the low-cost carriers and the internet really drove a coach and horses through that old model of how the customers were going to be carried out on one rotation and brought back on another. So that's been sort of forced on, and the industry's adapted to that. I think there are other orthodoxies that are gradually melting. I think the assumption that we can carry on sending millions of people to these destinations without taking into account the sort of impacts that Malcolm was talking about we may not be going as fast as we want, but I think that is gradually happening. I think there are still some entrenched mindsets. I mentioned when I spoke earlier about the idea that choice is just good in itself. I think that we still do tend to sort of just offer people an abundance of choice and think that is a satisfactory consumer proposition, which I think it isn't. And I think there are some more deep-rooted, diversity, for instance, within the travel industry has still got a long way to go in terms of women and gender and race and everything. I just compare it to other industries I've worked in. So we've still got a way to challenge some of those.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, obviously, we can all see with our own eyes the diversity challenge. But why is it as it is, do you think?
Well, I don't think we've been imaginative enough about career paths within the UK generally, but within travel, recognising the breaks that women might want to take in the course of their careers, or not just women, people who want sabbaticals, want to go out and refresh themselves, learn a new skill, bring them back in. I think we're still rooted in quite an old model of industrial production management, where you go in at the bottom and you kind of wait for the person above you to die. We've got to change that. I really do think that we won't be able to harness the energies of people if we don't.
Okay, well, I want to open it up to questions. So if you do have a question that you want to ask, I don't know if we can put any light on the audience so I can see if there... Oh, that's fantastic, thank you. There's a question here. If we can get a microphone to the front here, the gentleman at the front, that's number 1. And then I'll get, if anyone else is ready and willing, I can get... And there's a Lord Fowler at the front here as well. If we can get microphone 2, and then a gentleman halfway back on the aisle, we get microphone 3 or 4 to him, and that'll start us off wonderfully. Sir.
Richard English, this is a question for Malcolm. The atmosphere and the water situation, we of course use both of them, but we don't use them up. There's as much water and as much air on the earth as there ever has been. So is the real problem not one of redistribution and recycling? And if it is, what would you think would be the solution?
Well, how long have you got?
We've got 17 minutes until the end of the session. Do not take it all.
One of the strategies is reuse and recycling. But in certain places, the other thing you will have spotted particularly about water is it's not particularly transportable. And so you have populations in places where there isn't water, and you've got water where there isn't population. And then you have to really think about how do you deal with those things. And so technology actually is a big part of the answer. Although I would question, you're right, it's about water goes around in cycles, so does the atmosphere. But carbon dioxide takes 100,000 years to break down. So whilst it goes up, it stays there. So a lot of this is about technology solutions, whether it's about capturing carbon dioxide or it's about being able to create water in places where there isn't water. SAB Miller as an example, most of you have heard of them, a big brewer. They desalinate all the water they use in their brewery in Dar es Salaam. So they don't use the water. They create water. They actually create more water than they use because they give it back to the communities as well. Because once you've built a big plant, you might as well run it at maximum capacity. So there are strategies for how you do those things, whether it's reuse, recycle, or use technology to create in different ways.
Great, thank you very much. We'll go to Lord Fowler.
Lord Fowler, a question for Ian. Just before the political parties disappeared, as he was predicting, just going forward to 2016, not 2025, who does he think, and after the election, who does he think are going to be the 3 or possibly 4 political leaders after that? And could I just ask a sub-question? We all admired his prowess on the Brighton beach in getting rid of the chap with the placard. As one of his authors, can I rely upon a similar ferocity in defending my interests?
I'll take that last one as read. Political leaders in 2016, well, let's start with the Liberal Democrats. They're either going to be part of a coalition government after the next election or they're not. If they are, I would expect Nick Clegg to still be the leader of the Liberal Democrats. Ed Miliband, when he became leader, was very anti-Nick Clegg, but they seem to have developed a slightly warmer relationship now. If they as I predict, are obliterated at the next election, by which I mean I think they will get fewer than 25 seats, could be a lot fewer than 25 seats, then I would expect Nick Clegg to go very quickly and be replaced probably by Tim Farron, whose main asset seems to be that he talks with a very northern accent, so everyone trusts him. But he's actually a very, very nice guy and very entertaining. But he's not wholly trusted by some of his own party. Ed Miliband has one shot at it. I mean, if he doesn't win the next election, and I think, as I said, it is his to lose, he will be gone very quickly. My prediction, for what it's worth, sitting here now, I think Labour will win the next election. I think they will win an overall majority, and he will be Prime Minister. And I think he may well get it by default. But it does partly depend on the economic performance, because the Conservatives' main asset is, if the recovery continues, is going to be, well, we've got the economy going, do you really want to risk it? And the British electorate are fairly conservative with a small c. So I think he's got one shot at it. If he went after the next election, well, this time last week I wouldn't have mentioned the name Tristram Hunt. But I will mention the name Tristram Hunt now, purely on the basis that he was brilliant on Question Time last week and has made a very good start as Shadow Education Secretary. Labour Shadow Cabinet now is full of very young people, and it's a big risk for Ed Miliband because there's not a lot of experience there. But you've got people like him, you've got Chuka Ramuna, you've got Rachel Reeves, you've got a whole new generation coming forward. Very quickly on the Conservatives, again, if David Cameron doesn't win the next election, he will be gone. I've got no idea who would replace him. I mean, everyone talks about Boris Johnson. Well, it's sort of, he's a sort of candidate where you think, yeah, that would be good fun. But and he is a phenomenon. I mean, if you walk down the street with Boris Johnson, I mean, you are in the presence of a major star. His politics don't matter. He is mobbed. I mean, communists mob him. They love him. And that is a great asset for a politician. But being Mayor of London, I think, is very different to being Prime Minister. And in the end, I think that's what will hold him back. He's also not in the House of Commons. The 2010 intake of Tory MPs don't really know him. He hasn't cultivated them at all. So he would be a contender if he got back into the Commons. Theresa May, I think, would be a contender now. She's, I think, been impressive as Home Secretary. George Osborne, everyone says, well, he thinks he would be the natural successor. Can't see it myself. But then again, you've got this another new generation of Tory MPs coming forward, so I suspect it may well be someone who's not even in the cabinet yet. Sorry, that's a long answer, I apologise, I'll shut up now.
Excellent, we'll go to microphone 3, and is there anyone else that wants to ask a question so I can get a microphone hot-footed to you? Yes, we'll have number 1. So we'll go for number 3 and then number 1, thank you.
Okay, Bojan Jokic is my name. Question to Graham, thanks for the inspiring speech. You talked a lot about epic changes and once in a lifetime, or whatever we want to call it. So those are big words. And so I have actually 2 questions in one. The first question is, how many, to the entire panel, you think expert panels were talking about epic fundamental changes in the last, let's say, 500 years or last 100 years? And the second, which is related to the first question, what is it that we know now that all those experts previously preventing fundamental changes and advising industries how they should change? No, because the fact is that only 2 out of the SP 500 original companies exist today. So what is it that we can possibly know today about the future, and how can we apply that where nobody has ever succeeded?
Right, well, you think about your response to that, because that's quite a big question. Can we get a microphone to the gentleman in the press row right at the back as well? But if you would like to answer. Graham, you kick us off on that one.
It's an important question, and maybe the best question to ask after a series of presentations like we've seen. And there's a number of answers. The first is we do have to be careful of what's called historical exceptionalism, where everybody thinks, regardless of which era they live in, that they are living in the most profound, the most changed era. And of course, if you go back and have a look in each of the, just create decades, if you like, of the last 100 years, you'll see that each one of those decades had profound changes, and we could have said similar things. However, I do think that at the moment we are correct. In different decades, different things have been issues. So there have been political changes in some decades, and there have been cultural changes in other decades. There have been technological advances in others. But I do think that every now and again, and it's about every 200 years or so in history, all of those changes tend to coalesce at one moment in time. And it normally is driven, Mark actually gave some of those iconic moments. It's normally driven by a technology change that creates a communication or connection change, which then creates a political, economic, and social change. And it was the invention of the wheel, actually, how many years ago? Okay.
I forget, there's a lady in the audience.
Somebody in the audience knows. It was the invention of paper, it was the printing press. I think it was then electricity and mechanization, which was the industrial era, which was, again, a connection technology. And now it's been the internet. And I do think that you can see that, and you can see the big shifts because of that technology to connection to political, economic, and social change. So I stick by the statement that we are living in a historically exceptional time. How do we then know whether our predictions will be right, or why would we be better than other people in the past? Two reasons. The first is because I think we are the first generation to know for sure that we don't know for sure what the future holds. And that's not just a throwaway line. I do think that people in the past knew that change was coming, but I think they thought they knew what that change would bring. And we don't, and we know it. And that's a new mindset. I really do believe that the MBA type leadership that business schools are teaching is part of the problem in the world today, not the solution. Because it teaches people to break things down in an industrial-like way, look at all the little bits of components, fiddle with each of them, put it back together, voila, you've got the future. It doesn't work that way. And we've got to learn new ways of thinking, new mindsets, new models. If we do that, I think we might have some success in dealing with uncertainty.
Does anyone else on the panel want to add to what Graham's been saying? Or should we move on to our next question? Let's go to the lady who, yes.
So Anne-Marie Perry from WorldPay. I'm looking at this differently from a technological perspective. So over the last 6 months, I've been speaking with airlines specifically around some of the changes in the retail platform. So typically, if you look at the likes of Oracle and IBM, and what they're doing to move into new markets, so globally penetrate new customers, and how can we learn from the patterns of what they're doing and some of the actual sophistications of the retail platforms in place, and mirror that across when you start to look at the Amadeuses and the Sabres and so forth that help us to operate the businesses. So I'm interested to understand a little bit more about what is the actual appetite from a technology perspective to learn from some of the retailers in how we can cross-sell and upsell within our own infrastructure.
Matt, do you want to have a go at that?
I sort of caveat anything that I say with I'm not a travel industry expert, but what I would say is we know, in a way, following on from what Graham said, the only thing we know is that what we were doing for the past however many years doesn't work anymore. And so I think what we need to look at is that what do we know that's new? And all of that is the social layer, if you like. All of that is about knowing that, and you can see it from Amazon, sort of people who liked that like this kind of stuff. It's already here and it's already quite tangible. So I think there's a huge appetite for putting that data to good use. At the same time, there is, it's sort of the same problem that newspapers have got in that we know that there is a huge chunk of the market that love print and there is a huge chunk of the market that love digital, and there is some overlap, but not perhaps that much. The travel industry, it seems to me, has got there's that huge chunk of people that will only ever buy a holiday by going into a travel agent, and there are people like me that have literally never set foot in a travel agent and don't feel like I'm missing out on anything. Now, I'm sure there are hundreds of people here that will explain what I'm missing out on, but it's not getting in the way of my ability to buy a good holiday. So there's a real need to sort of put those two halves of the industry together, I think.
You're a brave man.
Mark, anything to add to that?
Well, obviously I'd stick up for the high street travel agent, because I think they do offer a very special product to people who want advice and guidance. But I think what I've noticed is that when I literally the first day I was at ABTA, there was a regional meeting in London, and where you have the members come in, and one put up his hand and he said, I call on you as the new chief executive, this was 8 years ago, to spend £1 million out of reserves on a campaign to stop people using the internet. And I thought, have I made the right career choice? He's no longer a member, I have to say. But I thought, have I made the right career choice? But also, it was just then it was high street versus internet, whereas now, I've just done some research that says it is much more multi-platform. I'll use, an online for my travel experience to research it or to book a point-to-point flight. If I want something more complicated, I'll go into a shop. And I think when you say, what do we learn from other retailers, I think it is that interconnectedness that we don't all fall into those neat categorizations that perhaps we thought we did 5 years ago.
Some of it is really simple. I mean, Thomas Cook, for instance, the second you leave the store, they are able to email you, here's the stuff you looked at, and it's just another nudge to connect those two. And I think starting to put that stuff together, it doesn't feel like rocket science, but it's a huge shift for a number of industries.
Now, just before we go to the microphone 4, which is at the back, I've got just a couple more minutes. Is there anybody else that is burning to ask a question so I can get a mic to you? Speak now or hold your peace. Okay, we'll go to the gentleman at the back.
Ian Taylor, Travel Weekly. I'm somewhat surprised that we spent the whole morning talking about the future without talking at all hardly about the economy and how serious the recovery is in Britain and elsewhere, and the impact of the gap between earnings growth and inflation, and the fact that this looks set to continue for several years yet. Graham Codrington has mentioned it a couple of times. So I wonder why we haven't talked about that, why we haven't heard from an economist. More important, I wonder what the view of some of the panellists, particularly maybe you, Mark, and you, Malcolm, is of the state of the economy. And I wonder what impact the possibilities of economic growth or further problems have, particularly on what you've talked about, Malcolm, because the subject of your talk requires investment. And what we know since 2008 is that investment falls when GDP doesn't grow.
Okay, now before our panel come on to that, in fact, I'm very interested to know what everybody in the room thinks the economic situation is at the moment. So could I have a show of hands? I'm going to do 3. Compared to this time last year, is your business, as in the growth of your business, worse, the same, or better? So we'll start off, so this is whether you're making as much money now as you were 12 months ago. So first of all, show of hands if it's exactly the same. Show of hands if it's, okay, a smattering of the same. Show of hands if it's worse, people are spending less money than they were this time last year. No one prepared to admit it. Show of hands, not that I'm accusing you of lying, show of hands if it's better now than it was this time last year. Okay, we've got a few people sitting on their hands, but that was a vast majority. Okay, so the room is definitely more optimistic than it was this time last year, or certainly going to say, Mark, why have we not heard from an economist? What is your view of travel's prospects, GDP?
Well, I mean, we didn't not have an economist, to diss the profession of professional economists, in spite of what I said earlier about being slightly obsessed with economics. I think each of us in our own way has sort of touched on some of the deep underlying economic trends, really, that are going to change us in the long term. And I think there is a certain amount of cynicism about economists in terms of you can get two equally plausible and equally expert economists telling you diametrically opposed things, and it's very difficult to tell which is going to turn out. I think I think that Vox Pop you just did, Daisy, showed probably more about the economy than a lot of charts. That it's partly reality, it's partly confidence as well, that people feel that we have turned some corner over the last 18 months, I think, however slow growth is. So that's kind of where I see it. I think a slow, you saw the growth forecasts from the IMF were not stellar, so it's going to be a long haul.
Ian, I suppose I give the last word to you as somebody who both has one foot in the political world, but equally you talk to your radio listeners every single day, and a lot of what we all talk to listeners or viewers about is their confidence, their mood, how they feel. Now obviously it's London centric, so we'll take that into view, but what's your view about is George Osborne right that we're past the worst, we're definitely on the up, there's going to be no triple dip? Obviously if your prediction about the euro comes true, that's all that makes it very different, but putting that to one side, are we through it?
As Mark says, confidence breeds confidence, and I think over the past 6 months, and I probably would say only over the last 6 months, I think there has been a bit more confidence more generally in the economy. I don't think we're out of the woods yet at all, and any coalition politician that goes on your TV screens and says that we are, I think they're talking through the hat, because there are so many extraneous factors now. It's not just up to what the Chancellor of the Exchequer does in this country. Last week, we nearly went over the precipice into a world recession because the Americans nearly hit their debt ceiling. And if they had, that would have made the collapse of Lehman Brothers look sort of relatively innocuous. And I don't think people have quite grasped yet the consequences if that had happened. And it could still happen again in January. And we're not out of the woods yet on the Eurozone by any stretch of the imagination. So I think it's not going to take much to plunge people back into a sense of pessimism about the economy. It would just take a couple of very bad economic statistics or a couple of world events to do that. But as we sit here now, things certainly look a lot brighter than they did a year ago.
Okay, well, I think that is something that clearly we can all agree on. Please show your appreciation for our panel as they leave the stage.